Welcome to Animal Justice Academy's Lunchtime Live. I'm Kimberly Carroll, and I am the director of Animal Justice Academy. Today, our theme is Getting Wild Animals Out of Captivity in Canada, and we have joining us Melissa Matlow and Rob Laidlaw. Welcome to you lovely beings, Melissa and Rob, and welcome to all of you who are joining us. It's so wonderful to have you here and live, and to those of you who are watching the replay. So I just first of all want to say thank you to Rob and Melissa. It's a busy time wrapping up for the year. Rob's not wrapping up for the year. He's in the middle of a bunch of active campaigns. But instead of me sort of doing the bio, the official bio, I'm going to throw it to you first of all, and just to give us a little background on you and well, first of all, Rob, we'll start with you. You and Zoocheck. Tell us a little bit about you so people are a little bit more familiar with you.
Sure. It's actually a long story, but I'll keep it very brief because we are in a very condensed time frame today. I started out as the kid who read every animal book, every conservation book, every environment book in the library. Had that interest from whenever I could remember. 1979, I saw a film called The Animals Film that sort of said to me, it's not enough to know about things, we have to act. So I started to look for something to do and ended up starting several organizations. In 1984, I happened upon a zoo in Ontario called the Wasaga Beach Game Farm, was at that time a 100% zoo supporter, although I had some discomfort with zoos even as a child, but I was a zoo supporter. I was utterly horrified, and I'll keep it super brief and just say that initially I decided to do something about that zoo. Found out there were other zoos, thought I would deal with those other zoos, thought it would take 18 months. Now, 40 years later, I'm still at it. So during the course of those 40 years, I've been involved in a lot of different projects in Canada, extensively throughout Asia, Europe, South America, and I've done work for other groups as well, including the group that Melissa works for, World Animal Protection. Spent 5 years doing projects for them, working with the Cree in the north on dog issues, doing bear releases, doing all that, a lot of that work in Asia. And I'm also a former Humane Society inspector as well. And yeah, it's just been a long, long road, quite unexpected. And started Zoocheck in '84. That's been principally what people know me or associate me with. And I think we've done a lot of good work and have good work to come. So I'll stop there. If people have questions later, I'm happy to answer them. But basically, just as a child, it's just been an extension of my childhood interest in animals. I always wanted to help, and hopefully when I get ready to die, I can say that, hey, I did, at least a little bit.
Well, Rob, you are the definition of an animal rights OG. Like you are, I remember when I started in activism, oh God, 18 years ago. You were one of the first names I heard. I
Oh,
remember that. And so thank you for, that little kid. If we went back to that little kid and said, you're gonna spend a few decades doing this work, we were probably running the other way.
yeah, I honestly thought it would be a short-term thing, and
Mhm.
nobody's more surprised than I am. So.
Well, we're very lucky to have you, Rob. Thank you so much. And Melissa, tell us a little bit about, share a little bit about you and a little bit about your work.
Sure. Well, first, I'll say that I learned everything I know about captive wildlife welfare starting from meeting Rob. So, when I first started with World Animal Protection, we were called World Society for the Protection of Animals at that time. And I started in 2005, if you can believe it. And Rob was working with us. And I was handed the Ontario Roadside Zoo campaign. So, it was my first animal welfare campaign in a professional, setting to be able to be privileged enough to have that as my living. But before that, you might not know this about me. I grew up in St. Catharines, and for kids at school, the trip that we were taken on was to go to see Marineland. So as a kid, I don't think I questioned it too much. But at a certain point in high school, it clicked in. It's like, what are we doing? I think that's when Free Willy was coming out. Documentaries have such a huge impact on people. And I met Catherine Enns at the time. Her name's Catherine Herwood. And the first group I got involved with was Niagara Action for Animals. So Marineland was actually the first protest. The first placard I made was a message against Marineland. So
Yes, and I see you because we have a very good mutual friend, Jennifer Hollett, who talks about that being her first activism
yep.
with you and the two of you holding those placards. So I've always had this, image of little teen Melissa out there in front of Marineland.
So it's come full circle with these bills before us and still working on those same issues that came before me as a kid. So I've learned a lot over the years and look forward to chatting with you all about that.
And we'll probably hear a little bit more about the programs at both Zoocheck and World Animal Protection as we go. But I really want to jump in because there are so many areas of animal exploitation that we're dealing with in this movement, and we're all trying to attend to so many of them. Rob said why he was drawn to this work around the captivity of wild animals. Melissa, what was it for you that really drew you into it? Like, again, that you said, this is where I'm going to go.
It's immense animal suffering for these animals, like every day of their long lives in captivity. I mean, we often see news articles about when an animal dies, but my heart like gravitates towards their daily life living before they die in captivity. So the suffering is immense, but also I think it's solvable, and it's like there's easy solutions, and there's not anyone that I've met that is for roadside zoos across political spectrums and different beliefs on animal use. It's a no-brainer that you shouldn't have a tiger as a pet or keep a roadside zoo without any experience. So I feel I'm just excited to have this conversation with all of you activists, because I think with enough effort, with us all banding together, I think we can win these campaigns.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's just really back up, Rob, and if you can give us a little bit of a lay of the land about wild animals in captivity in Canada. So, how pervasive is it, and are there any standards? Is there any oversight?
Well, yes and no. But the landscape of the issue today is profoundly different than it was 30 years ago. And that doesn't mean that the problem has been resolved, because it hasn't. We still have a huge problem with wildlife in captivity. But what we've seen with some animals and some types of institutions and businesses is a shift in their predominance in the industry, or a shift in the types of animals that are being kept by private individuals. When you look at wildlife in captivity in Canada, there's sort of two meta populations. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of wild animals kept by private individuals as pets, and they are part of the traditional and specialty pet trade. A lot of that, regular members of the public who aren't interested won't really hear too much about that type of trade, unless it's a sensational incident where, a monkey gets out of somebody's house and it hits the news. But for hundreds of thousands or millions of animals, and I'm including fish and reptiles and amphibians and many birds and many mammals too, they're sort of off the radar screen. So you have that huge sort of meta population that's privately kept, mostly for amusement purposes. And then you have another meta population of wildlife in captivity, which are the businesses, organizations, and institutions that keep those animals. So you have zoos and aquariums, you have roadside zoos, regional zoos, conservation centers, you have sanctuaries, you have private menageries, you have, in recent years, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of mobile zoo businesses. So you've got this whole other sort of meta population of wildlife in captivity. And I think most people are familiar with some of those. Those are the ones that generally hit the news more than some of the private keeping does. But the landscape is different. When you look at the privately kept animals, there are still animals that used to be kept years ago, but they're in reduced numbers. Back, you go 25, 30 years ago in Ontario, there were an estimated 2,000 exotic cats kept by private individuals. And any one of us could go out and buy a cat for $100, a tiger, a lion, put them in your car and drive home. It's a little bit different today. The numbers are greatly reduced, but what we've seen is a shift from those megavertebrates, let's call them, a shift away to other kinds of animals. So a lot of the people that were keeping big cats and wolves and all those creatures that are today more problematic have shifted to kangaroos and wallabies and capybaras and other kinds of primates and all that. So a lot of the problem has sort of morphed into something else, but it's still a problem. And certainly here in Ontario, where we lack regulations for exotics, it's the biggest problem in Canada. Across the country, there's a patchwork of legislation, captive wildlife, exotic, or certainly native wildlife as well, are delegated as a provincial responsibility. There's very few federal laws or regulations that apply to wildlife in captivity. And then many provinces download some of that responsibility to municipalities. So it's just a mess across the country. There's no consistency in anything. It's getting a little bit better than it was, but there's still a long way to go. So I don't know if Melissa has anything else to add to that.
Well, just to say that, yeah, I agree. Like Ontario is the worst, and it is a patchwork too, because there are, and this gets so confusing, but you don't need a license or any qualifications, a purpose, a knowledge, a reason to keep a tiger as a pet or a roadside zoo in Ontario. Most other provinces have some sort of licensing system that covers both native and exotic wildlife. There are some minimum standards for native species in zoos. Or actually, it applies to exotic animals too. The standards of care in the Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act in Ontario, but they're not being enforced.
Yeah.
So there's just a culture of non-compliance with that. But as Rob said, a lot of this problem is being pushed to the municipalities, but then only half the municipalities have bylaws to address these problems. And they're a patchwork too, because they typically are passed to react to a situation that had in the particular community. So what we're lacking is something more comprehensive and proactive to prevent the proliferation of this animal welfare problem into different forms.
Now, let me inject a ray of sunshine into the darkness.
Please
Because we're
do.
talking, and whenever you talk about any issues, there's a tendency to gravitate towards the doom and gloom, because that's what we're all trying to change, regardless of what's happened previously. But the classic sort of roadside zoo operation, the quintessential sort of definition of roadside zoo, those types of zoos used to be spread everywhere in Canada. They were in PEI, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, right across to BC, and even a few in the territories. Well, today, those sort of old style, the quintessential idea of a roadside zoo, they're pretty much gone west of Ontario and east of Ontario. Now, that doesn't mean there are not still bad zoos in places outside of Ontario, because there are. But the roadside zoos are largely a phenomenon today of Ontario. That's a sea change from years ago. And I can say there's been a lot of zoos closed. We've had a role in closing over 50 zoos in Canada. So we've seen a shift in the wildlife in captivity paradigm in Canada from what it was years ago. But if you're starting today, you might think it's all doom and gloom, but there's been remarkable change. A lot of it very, very positive. So, and people should understand that if they want to get involved, well, in any issue, understand historically what the situation was, what's gone on, because that may give them motivation and hope that they can then take it further.
Absolutely. And, you know, the fact is this area of animal protection is one of the ones that we're having the most movement on right now.
Yep.
And that's exciting. That makes it exciting and makes it, you know, especially important as a precedent setting, you know, arena. But I just want to, you know, I'm so glad you explained that, Rob, about the roadside zoos, because I mean, I understand that Ontario is where all the roadside zoos go, but I didn't really know why they weren't anymore. You know, I just figured the provincial regulations, but I am from Manitoba originally. And when I first moved to Ontario and I'm on the highway and I'm seeing African lion safari, are they having lions and elephants here in Ontario? So it was a real shock to me. And the other thing that was a shock to me is that these roadside zoos in Ontario, you don't even need a license. Camille Lapchuk, our executive director at Animal Justice, always says, you need a license to build a patio in Ontario. You don't need a license to open a zoo.
Right.
Need a license to keep a house cat in many municipalities. You don't need one for a tiger. How does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, okay, so I think it's, also important because we're getting a couple of questions in the chat. For example, I'll just mention sorry, I lost who said it, but they were saying they saw a speaker named Joel Satrour, and the talk was called Photo Arc, and he was taking portrait photos of captive animals before they go extinct. Joel claims that for humans to want to protect wild animals, they first have to meet them, that we won't want to protect them otherwise. He was arguing for that reason. Zoos are necessary. So what are the arguments against this? This is what comes up a lot when you're dealing with zoo issues. Who wants to handle that?
Well,
Melissa, why don't you go? Oh, sorry,
okay.
Rob, you go first.
Yeah,
No,
you go.
all ladies first. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I like to bring up the Algonquin Park wolf howl as an example. Every Thursday evening in August, people go to Algonquin Park, thousands, just for the chance of hearing a wild wolf howl back at the imitated call from a park naturalist. You don't even have to see these wolves, and you might not even hear them, but people are that excited for that wilderness experience. So I don't think you need to be up close to animals to care about them. And I think we have to do more to foster an appreciation and respect in the native species that we share our own environment with. Kids, people of all ages need to be more connected to their local environment. They have more agency and ability to care for those animals and ensure they're protected in the long run.
Rob, what do you have to say? What's your standard answer to this question?
Well, it's actually multifaceted. A few years ago, I listed 21 points that refuted the idea of zoo education as it's done today, because the primary educational vehicle for most of the visitors going to zoos, even today, and that's right across the board, all kinds of zoos, is viewing the animal in the cage. So if you put aside that small subset of people that engage in organized lectures and other types of educational events that may have more robust level of content, and look at the vast majority of visitors, it's very curious. Number one, there's very, very little evidence that they're learning anything except factoids about animals. And like William Conway, he was the dean of the New York Zoological Society in the Bronx Zoo for many years. He would say, with regard to factoids, well, what good is it to know the record length of an orangutan's left arm, or these types of sort of miscellaneous facts that you get through graphics or get through zoo visits. So there's very little evidence of substantive educational benefit, and even less evidence, it's almost non-existent, of behavior change after the visit. And if you're saying you're an institution of conservation and education, and that you are actually educating the masses, then you should see some outcomes from that, but there's very little evidence of outcomes. But if you look at the whole idea, most zoos are set up in sort of the original menagerie style format, and it's moving from one animal to another, to another, to another. If you look at how long people look at animals, it ranges from about 1 to 90 seconds. And basically all you can see is the size, shape, and color of the animal. They're completely removed from their natural ecological context. They can't really move or behave like they do in nature. So to me, when you're looking at animals that are in that environment, and you're looking at them for such a brief period of time, then to me, it's completely nonsensical to claim that you can learn much of anything. So
except that, oh, these animals are kept in a cage. These
right.
animals must be like kept captive, like
right.
That's what it's teaching, captivity, right?
Well, exactly. Well, you hit on a key point, because anybody who is assessing the beneficial aspects of zoos in terms of education, they don't then also study the negative aspects of that. But the whole thing, I think, is one of the great mythologies of modern zoos. I think the potential exists, but the way they're doing it now, with the primary vehicle being viewing the animal in the cage, that to me, and I've looked at this stuff for 4 decades. I just still remain unconvinced that it works. If it did, I would admit it. I have no problem admitting when I'm wrong. If the evidence was there, I would say, yeah, they do that. Maybe I would still think it's wrong, but I have never seen the evidence. And we have hired people, we have hired PhDs, we've done literature searches and all that, and we just don't see compelling evidence that viewing the animal in the cage is a positive educational experience. In fact, I would say it's probably negative.
I was just going to say that there's very harmful education that comes from some of this, especially direct interactions with animals. There are some zoos that still allow you to get in a cage and do a selfie with a very dangerous animal, and that is counterproductive. It's the opposite of what our conservation officers and park rangers tell Canadians about going for a hike. Like, keep a respectful distance. You don't get close to these animals, and that's like a dangerous message for people.
The other thing I'd like to point out, because people might not realize this, is that when you go to most zoos, what you get are sanitized messages about conservation, about animals, about other things. And they're sanitized, meaning that they're, the threats to wildlife, the true scale and horrific nature of what's going on for animals in the environment, the immediacy of the concern and all of it, it's not conveyed. It's a very sort of weak message when you go. And that's because most people go to zoos, they're families with kids, or they're just people out for a nice day out. They go out for recreation. Zoos know that, and they don't want to offend with, graphic images or with real world messaging.
Or depress them. Yeah, they don't want to depress people, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's very dangerous, because if you're not educating people in a real world way, and I don't think people need to leave the zoo without any hope. I think you can do that. You can educate people. I've seen it done about the gravity of the situation facing animals in the environment, and they can still leave the zoo with hope. So this sanitization of the messaging, which also placates government sponsors and corporate sponsors, they don't want anything to do if you're going to be criticizing, companies that are engaged in making the climate change escalate and all. Like, they don't want to alienate anybody, so it's sanitized. I think that does a disservice to animals in the environment and to the purported intent of zoos.
And Melissa, one other, and Rob brought it up, but one of the other big myths that people get all caught up in when they're trying to defend, going to zoos is, well, what about conservation and rescue purposes? So are zoos actually doing a service around conservation?
There's very little transparency on that, and I think Rob has good statistics on the percentage of budget that goes to conservation. And with rescue, I mean, a legitimate sanctuary wouldn't breed their animals. They wouldn't allow public display of the animals. They would be sure to, not bring those animals off site and parade them around in mobile zoos or other locations. So I think we, in looking at legislation, which we'll get to soon, it's about what is the criteria. There's, some captivity that, we might all have varying degrees of support for, but like sanctuaries are captive settings. When animals are seized from the exotic pet trade or the wildlife trade, they can't be released into the wild. They have to go somewhere. So what is that bar that we all agree on that's legitimate for protecting the animal's best interests and welfare and ensuring that they're there for a reason? And I think that's what we're always looking for, is how do you define the purpose of captivity and what is because you can, honestly, there are people with the right intentions that want to rescue animals, but they might keep animals in very poor conditions. We've seen that where places call themselves a sanctuary, their heart's in the right place. They really do believe they're rescuing these animals, but they might have a lower standard than some zoos. So it's not that easy to say I support a sanctuary and I'm against a zoo. It's about what is captivity and when does it benefit the animal? When is it a good thing? Because the animal can't be released into the wild. And when is it serving a legitimate purpose to help a species? I think many of us, maybe not all of us, would agree that it's okay if they're being bred to be released back into the wild to prevent a species from going extinct. So what is that threshold that has to be met to ensure that there is a legitimate conservation purpose? That's tough. That's tough to get in regulations and figure out what that bar is.
Yeah, and I'd like to step it back and point a couple of things out. Number one, captive breeding can be a useful, and that's the vehicle that most zoos bring forward first when they're talking about their conservation contributions. They talk about captive breeding, although the better zoos, the progressive zoos, have an integrated approach where they're doing some in situ work, they're doing some research work. It's a far more comprehensive approach to conservation, although they too often bring out this idea of captive breeding. Zoos are not set up to be conservation institutions. Most people don't realize that. Zoos are set up for human recreation. And if you look at how zoos are designed, the allocations of budget in the initial capital phase when they're building zoos and all that, 70 to 80% of budgets are allocated towards things that are for humans, not for animals. And that's right across the board. You can look at zoo budgets in India, Japan, Canada, elsewhere, and you can see very clearly that the majority of the resources that are being allocated in development of zoos are basically for the recreational experience for people. And so you've got an institution that's set up for recreation that may legitimately and honestly be trying to do conservation, but it's not set up for that. So it's very challenging. And that's why you see when there are legitimate conservation things in terms of captive breeding, why they're often behind the scenes, black-footed ferrets, Vancouver Island marmots, or the amphibian ark. They're not on public display. They're behind the scenes or they're off-site. If you go to conservation breeding centers that are dedicated to that purpose, they are usually not even open to the public. So you've got this entity. It's like fitting the square peg into the round hole. It doesn't really work. So you've got a huge impediment. And then you've got public zoos, private zoos, all these different motivations. Some public zoos are not allowed to devote any money to conservation. So they try to do it internally. They can't take their budget money and allocate it to in situ conservation. So they do other things. So people should realize they're set up largely for recreation. They are not set up as conservation institutions. It's great that there are people in there trying to do things that are legitimately interested and want to help. There's, I know many of them, but they're not set up for conservation. And this idea that they're going to make it some type of substantive difference in stemming biodiversity loss through captive breeding is ridiculous. What zoos can do collectively, even if all of them got together all over the world, which they will never do, but if they did collectively, they could only save a very few species. And I think it's very dangerous to tell the public that, hey, we're breeding animals, creating the impression that they're repopulating the wild when that is rarely ever done. And when it has been done, it's still heavily managed situations in the wild. It's not that, hey, those species are okay now. It's still heavily managed. I think that has the potential to create complacency in the public and make them think, well, they're taking care of it. We don't need to do anything, when it's exactly the opposite.
So yeah, so we have these very next to no, and if anything, maybe damaging sort of outcomes of zoo programs to humans. And we haven't even begun to speak about the individuals that we're talking about in captivity in Canada right now. So and again, many of the folks that have joined us kind of know the basic issues, but it's really good to bring it home. Why it's so problematic for the animals, why keeping it's pretty obvious, keeping an animal in prison for their entire life, but let's get into a little bit of the nuances, a little bit about why this is so awful for an individual. Melissa, you want to give us a start to
Sure.
this?
I mean, I guess wild animals have such complex needs and they're very difficult to keep in captivity. And even the largest enclosure isn't good enough for any species. And it's not just those charismatic megafauna we always talk about, the elephants, the great apes, the cetaceans. It's, I've learned a lot through Rob too, just about the amazing lives and needs of reptiles. We hardly, speak about those. There's so many different species. And to think that, there was a zoo in southwestern Ontario that recently changed hands, and the new owners, their experiences, they ran an Airbnb. How on earth does someone who have that background know how to keep a large collection of animals? I hate to use the word collection, but sometimes I slip into the zoo industry speak because we're talking to them and wanting to use the language that we can relate to, but it is a collection to them. It's a hobby. These are hobbies for people like collecting stamps, and that's wrong. But it's, when I've gone to the same zoo, every couple years and it's not even as long as Rob has gone to these same zoos, but over 10 years, and it's the same enclosure and the same animal. It is heartbreaking because you're leaving them, but they are still there in that same barren enclosure with little more than a food and water dish and a shelter box to sleep in, no privacy, always in public view, lots of stressors, sometimes close to a highway. If they're at marine land, they're close to roller coasters and all these other noises. And it's not hard to imagine the type of suffering they would go through.
Yeah, I always, one of the things I always have to remind myself is these are not animals that have gotten domesticated over thousands of years. They're wild animals. Many of them have been taken out of the wild. And so the area that they traversed is probably, for a lot of them, hundreds of square kilometers, and then being taken out of their family systems. I mean, it's just a horrific thing to happen to a wild free animal.
It is.
So I want to really get into a little bit about what's happening, some big developments brewing politically. So in 2019, there was a groundbreaking law that passed that phases out the captivity of whales and dolphins in Canada. We were all involved in that. It was super exciting. One of the first bits of animal protection legislative developments in I don't know how long. And then, so now there are two federal bills being considered to phase out the captivity of some other species. Now, I know some of the folks here have heard of the Jane Goodall Act, but now there is also the House's Bill S15. And so I think there's a lot of confusion about what is what and what bill we should be most working on and how we champion that. So, Rob, can you give us a little bit of the lay of the land with these bills to start with?
Yeah, the Senate Bill S241 had originated with Murray Sinclair in 2020 and then was reintroduced by Senator Marty Klein in 2022. That was, or is, because it's still in play, a fairly far-reaching bill that would have a number of objectives, and I'll just mention a few of them. One of them would be, for all intents and purposes, a phase-out of elephants in captivity in Canada, which is certainly welcome. I think it would be a great precedent that would be looked at positively from all over the world. It was also looking at a tremendous restriction on great apes in captivity. So really, it would largely end the keeping of great apes in captivity, except in very specific kinds of circumstances. But it also did other things. It was far-reaching in that there were an additional set of designated animals that were in excess of 800 species that would be regulated federally, something that's never happened before. And part of that regulation would ensure that there were no new captivity of all of these 800 species, except under very exceptional circumstances where it was for bona fide conservation purposes or in the best interests of the animals, like in a sanctuary setting. So it did other things. Some with there were some trade provisions, establishment of a limited kind of rights for some animals. So it was a very, very progressive law. It was spoken about very well by senators when it went through debate. And I think we're all sitting now waiting to see if it will go into hearings. It went through second reading, and the next stage is hearings. Whether or not it gets there, there's a lot of things that happen with this kind of legislation. So there's no guarantees that it will move forward. But I think the mere fact that it was even written and discussed was pretty important. Yeah, it really sort of indicated that, things have changed. 25 years ago, this would never, ever have even been written or proposed by anybody. So, it's a real indication of change. And then S15 is much more limited in scope. That is a government bill that's now in the Senate. And that was introduced just last month, November 2023. And that's far more limited in that it basically, at least now, as it's written, basically deals like the
S203.
S203. I get them mixed up myself. It deals with elephants and great apes very similar to S203, and would essentially with some limited ability for these animals to be here, but would essentially ban them in Canada. And I know ourselves and Melissa's group and others will be fighting for additional things to try to make that even better. I think that's got a potential chance of getting through. But again, just the fact that it's there is a real indicator that, yeah, people's sensibilities in government and elsewhere have changed. So that's good news.
Mhm. Melissa, should we be championing one or the other? Like it's very odd that there's these two bills sort of going head to head. And so where are we putting our energies?
It's confusing. I see how it can be confusing. The hard thing is that Bill S241, I think it's the bill we all want. It's more ambitious. It has a lower chance of passing.
Yeah.
So we want the government to take inspiration from Bill S241 and make Bill S15 stronger. And we will keep advocating for whatever we can get in there. But something is better than nothing. And as Rob said, like just ending elephant grade 8 captivity is massive. We have to think of it globally too. Like our organization works on trying to get a breeding ban on elephants in Thailand. Thailand has the most captive elephants in the world. So Canada saying this is no longer acceptable would be huge precedent for countries like Thailand and across Southeast Asia. So we'll keep trying to make S15 stronger. I think it has a better chance, but as Rob said, both bills are in play. So you can write to your member of parliament and say you want Bill S241 and see what happens, see where we get to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the thing. The Jane Goodall Act, S241, it has much less of a chance of passing than the government bill. So I think a lot of us are putting our attentions on trying to get S15 stronger, right?
Yeah.
And okay, so what you mentioned, the thing to do is to write to politicians. Now, Melissa, I know with Animal Justice we have an auto e-letter that you can send actually to, I think, the different senators, but as far as the S15, we're still working on that. So what do you recommend? What do you recommend as far as actions go?
Yeah, I mean, everything and anything is always helpful. I still think developing a relationship with your member of parliament is the way to go, because they're elected and they represent you and they're worried about your vote at election time. So you have more influence over them. We need to get to the Minister of Environment, yes, and we need to get to the senators, but they're not as concerned about you as an individual and how you think. And I would just advise that people take time to learn their position. So many times, we have 30 minutes and we take up 29 with telling them what we think. And it's so important to hear where they're coming from so you can work on influencing it. So personalizing that letter, developing a relationship with your MP. I know the bill's at the Senate right now, but it's eventually going to get to the House of Commons. So let's start getting those MPs involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Rob, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, just I think it echoes what Melissa is saying, that there are a whole suite of activities that you can get involved in when you're an activist. You know, you can do high level trade campaigns between countries, and you can protest in the street. But I think that everybody who's involved anywhere on that continuum should be looking for these opportunities where they can make a political difference, because we have far too few people engaging politicians and showing up in the venues at which they're deliberating these issues. And I'll just give you one example. There was an issue in the city of Toronto that was a pivotal issue. It was going to make a major change and set a precedent for the entire country. And there were many people who would go out to protest, which is great. That's fine. But I wish more people would have been reactive to what was going on in City Hall, because there were a lot of people doing the protest, and we had to pull teeth to get 5 people to show up and speak at a committee. I think people should recognize that there are these crucial things where they can make a real difference just by showing up, even if they just say, do the right thing. So I would urge everybody at any place on the continuum to look for those crucial opportunities where there's votes, where there's opportunities to influence your own politicians, those types of things, because we're under resourced in those areas in terms of human resources, and we need more people to be looking for those things and getting involved.
Yeah, and our AJers are actually, you know, those who have done the course, and basically in the last 2 years, we have really been training folks to engage with their MPs and their political reps in terms of not only reaching out to them, but meeting with them. So,
Yeah,
and we
that's
actually
great.
have a wonderful module in the AJ course with Gabriel Wilgen, who, Melissa, have you ever worked with Gabriel?
The name sounds so
No,
familiar.
yeah. So Gabriel was at HSI Canada for many years as a lobbyer. Yeah, so he did an amazing module. I think Kirsten will probably be able to find that and put it into the chat. And but yeah, it's one of the most powerful ways of changing like the course of history.
Yep.
And most Canadians don't, most citizens in general don't understand the power of it that they have, you know, as a citizen in a riding or in a city with a political rep, that they actually care. They actually care what you say, right?
Yep.
So yeah,
Yeah.
so as per usual, AJers, get politically active with this. Now, Rob, we have something especially hot right now, something that's happening, and it's only for a very small geographical area, but it can be a very powerful action. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about Noah's Ark and what's happening.
Yeah, right now in play in the regional municipality of Durham, and specifically in the town of Whitby, which is part of Durham.
Which is in Ontario for anybody
Yeah,
that's
just
outside. Yeah.
just east of Toronto. We have a facility that has applied for an exemption to the local exotic animal bylaw, and that facility is called Noah's Ark. It's a children's camp that deals with special needs kids, so kids with catastrophic disease or, you know, emotional problems or autism, or, you know, kids that have those kinds of special needs, and they bring them to this camp. You know, wonderful thing. But they also have 400 animals, and many of those are exotic animals, and they are putting animals and special needs kids and others who attend their programs together. And the town of Whitby, the staff have determined that that is a safety hazard. It's great source of liability for the towns should something happen. It's something they can't police and they don't have the expertise. So they have recommended that no exemption be given to this particular business, and that the dangerous animals, at least the exotic animals, be removed from the property. And then that would make this particular facility compliant with the bylaw. So ourselves, World Animal Protection, and a bunch of other people and groups are supporting the town of Whitby staff recommendation that no exemption be given. And what is needed at this point, because it's coming up on January 8th, is people in Durham and Whitby preferably, but in the regional municipality of Durham as well, to contact the mayor and members of council and tell them you support the staff recommendation. And I can tell you, I've heard from a number of councillors, and they are all saying that is the critical element right now, that people in the region write and say, do this, it's the right thing to do. They are depending on people to do that as support for what they're doing, because this is a different kind of facility, and that it's got the special needs kids and coming in. So a lot of people will say, well, what's the problem? They're helping kids. But there's more to it than that. So, counselors are going to want to rely on support from their community members who want to support the staff recommendation. And if they don't get it, well, who knows what will happen. So this is another situation where it's really challenging to get people to write, even people that are in this movement, because a lot of people, and I think you said with regard to the general population in Canada, most people are like this. You really sort of think, well, what's my letter going to do? Why should I make that call? What difference? But it does make a difference in a municipal campaign like this. If 10 people phone a councillor, that is a super hot issue, and that will have so much influence you can't even imagine. So that's the situation now. January 8th is the deadline. If people who know anybody in Durham, or you live in Durham, please call your councillor and write to the clerk. It's just clerk@whitby.com or .ca, and say you support the staff recommendation on this, and that'll go a long way towards ensuring that it actually happens.
Mm. Yeah, and so we have created an AJ action brief on this, which Kirsten just put into the comments. That just gives you the backgrounder on it. It tells you exactly what email to send it to, and a little bit about what you would say. Now, we just put it very simple, what Rob just said, but if you have something to add to that, if you have a personal anecdotal connection to this, as Nicole just said in the comments, as an autistic person, I find this place very offensive. If you have something that you can add to it,
Yes.
it makes it better, right, Rob?
Yeah. And I wanted to relate one story, because it's actually easy to get involved. I had one person that said, I'm interested in this issue. I sent all the information, and he responded that, well, he didn't really have time to write a letter. So I did my usual email back and said, well, it's actually easy. If you just say one sentence and put your name and address and send it in, that has an impact. That will take you 1 minute.
Yeah.
So on a lot of these things, it's not that you have to understand the issue like an expert would and write about all facets of it and come up with arguments for and against. And it's not like that. It's simply stating whether you support it, and you can do that in 1 minute on an email. It's that easy. So there's no excuse for not getting involved in things.
In fact,
Yes.
I'd say it's more authentic, right? Like
Yes.
we've heard, I know I've been on an AJ Academy webinar where Elizabeth May came in and just said, like, that the template letters, they see them all as one, and we still have to do them, but like they really do evaluate a personalized letter differently because they know it's you. It's so easy to sign something that our organization's created, and we want to give you the speaking points, but just cobbling together two authentic sentences is great.
Or you can do both. You can send in the form letter and another email as well, and double your impact, because a lot of times they're just counting who's for and against.
Yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. And so, okay, so there's a lot of people asking in the chat, do you need to be in Durham region to send the email? At this point, are we trying to keep it very narrow, Rob?
It's much better if it's from the constituents of the politicians who are making the decision. In this case, we initially expanded our call out to the region of Durham, even though elections in Whitby are restricted to Whitby residents. But I think it can be a negative. If too many people from outside of a jurisdiction write, that can be a negative. And we've had that feedback over the years because it's, collectively we can all generate, 5,000 emails. But if there's not a good mix of residents in with those 5,000, they may actually have a negative effect on what you're trying to achieve by alienating counselors. And a lot of the small towns, the counselors, they're answering their own emails. They don't have any staff filtering things. So if they get 500 in, they're going to be annoyed. So we want to avoid that. So I would say in this case, it's better if it's Durham residents, but I think maybe collectively as we get closer and gauge the situation, there may be a call out for people everywhere to write. And if so, please do.
But here's the action for those of you that aren't in the Durham region, which is Ajax, Oshawa, Whitby, Pickering, probably forgotten somebody, is, do you know anybody in one of those towns? And if so, that is your action, to send them the brief and ask them, or even just to compose the email for them and say, can you send this under your name and address? That's the, so everybody strain your brain. Do you know people in that area? And if so, you get on the phone or email or text them and ask them to do this for you. Okay, so I want to hear in the chat, do we have anybody in that area, or do we have anybody that knows people in that area, or are you going to strain your brain to figure that out? We'd really like to see this. Yeah, Cheryl said, good point, Rob. We don't want to come across as interfering big city folks, and that's really what happens in cases like this.
Yes, and we see it all the time. We've seen it for 40 years.
That's right.
That's same everywhere.
That's great. And you've got Jenny McQueen chatting. She's going to be presenting as well there. She says, that's great. Excellent. I know that we have somebody from, we've got Ben from Animal Justice doing it. Okay, so we have that link in the chat, and we'll also be putting that out to our main list too, so that we can get a lot of action on that. I want to go back now just to, because we're talking action, Melissa, our lowest hanging fruit right now is roadside zoos in Ontario. So
I don't know about lowest hanging fruit, the easiest thing. It's just the biggest problem.
I just mean more in all of animal rights. It might be one of the things that we actually have a hope of changing in the next few years.
Yes.
Let's go with yes.
We really need people to build that relationship with their MPP now. Because as we had talked about, every province has licensing systems and standards, and it raised the bar, and it did get rid of many roadside zoos across the country. Gazoo Animal Farm, remember that one in Three Hills, Alberta, one of the worst zoos in the country. So we need to do the same in Ontario. No one's against this. We have the Green Party, the NDP, the Liberals, the Municipality Association of Ontario. So much support for doing this. We just need to get MPPs to do it. I would say people who live in conservative MPP ridings in Ontario would be the most influential to us right now. So as Rob said, send even that 1 sentence, 2 sentence email that you want to see roadside zoo regulations. It's time to get it done. I mean, it too long.
That's right. Like AJers, we can just have a zoo hour in the next, the next couple of weeks. Well, I do it sooner than later. In the next 2 days before the holidays, have a zoo hour. Okay, if you are in, if you can, get the Nova's Ark out to people in the region. If you are in Ontario, can you drop a line to your MPP? If you're in Canada, can you contact your MP? And if you're elsewhere in the world, do a similar action to your political rep. Okay, so I'd love to hear. Yeah, use your influence. How many people, like, again, in the comments, I want to just sort of get some momentum going. How many of you are going to commit in the next 2 days to writing something to a political rep about animals in captivity. I'll just put you in there. Jenny says, love or hate him, Doug Ford is known for being an advocate for animals, mostly dogs, of course, though. Yeah. Doug Ford has not been a friend of ours.
He's also known for
this
flip-flopping, so
yeah,
maybe
yeah,
we can move him.
exactly. But we do know, and Jenny has put a great point across, when you are getting in touch with your reps, to know, are they animal lovers? Do they, treasure their dogs, their cats? Do they have a few, past where they talk about, animals and having a special connection? That's the sort of thing that you need to, really dig into and help make the connections for them. We also at Animal Justice have an action that's going to be coming up in the new year. I can't tell you much about it, but it involves an animal in a roadside zoo under great duress, and we're going to try and get that being out of that place. And so I want you to all keep an eye out for that in our emails, because that will be happening in January. One that's had some big media coverage in the past, is in poor conditions, and we're really going to see if we can bring some attention to that being. Okay, so last but not least, I just want to be able to say, as far as this issue, is this something, Rob, you have been in it for the long haul. Do you have hope of some major shifts happening around animals in captivity in the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Oh, a lot less than that. I've seen, because I'm old now. I've seen this dramatic change. It is completely different landscape for this issue. The paradigm has changed, and I think it changed, even though, during the first part of those years, there wasn't the recognition of the issue. There wasn't the discussion. There wasn't all these things that have happened since that have put it into the political and public consciousness. So I think there's going to be big changes, and these problems are going to be solved for captive wildlife. Obviously, we have thousands of animal issues, but I think for captive wildlife, they're going to be solved. And we've seen aspects of them solved. Like I said about roadside zoos, circuses with wild animals are largely a thing of the past in Canada. Whales and dolphins no longer allowed. We've seen so many changes that should all do nothing but motivate us in this particular suite of issues. So yeah, I think things are going to change. We're dealing a lot with reptiles right now, huge obstacles. I think we're going to win. I really do. We're going to change the paradigm for those animals. So yeah, I think there'll be good things to come, and in the near future, not the far future.
Oh, that is so good to hear. I mean, I don't like to get too starry-eyed, but it would be really amazing to close the book on one area of animal exploitation. That would be exciting. Melissa, how about you? What are your feelings about the campaigns you're working on and the movement you've seen?
Huge movement. I'm optimistic as well. I mean, who would have thought we would be saying Canada's a leader on banning whale and dolphin captivity? I know we can build on that leadership and legacy. I think we'll be able to pass a stronger Bill S15. Now's the right time if we have everyone on board pushing for it. Love to see big cats included in there. The US did it. Tiger King, as much as it failed to talk about animal welfare, it did raise people's awareness of the problem. And it's not just the legislation that passed, just talking about it has that ripple effect. Rob alluded to that as well. When we banned whale and dolphin captivity, we took that message to the travel companies and said, how could you be selling swim with dolphin experiences overseas when this is something that's illegal here in Canada? So they did. They stopped the sale of swim with dolphin experiences, the largest airlines in Canada and vacation companies. So we can see ripple effect like that when we just start talking about a bill. So yeah, so just keep all those campaigns alive and keep pushing for stronger protection. I think we'll get there.
Excellent. And Melissa, I do want to do a shout out to World Animal Protection's campaigns around tourism, because that's a really important piece. A lot of people forget that when they go traveling, that the rules of animal exploitation still apply,
Yeah.
you know, so it's great that you're going after travel companies and to be able to try to phase things out there.
Yeah, Mexico is a big hotspot for cetacean cruelty. You know, so many dolphins kept in entertainment in the Mayan Riviera. And where do Canadians go at this time of the year as the weather gets, you know, awful? So when we talk about using your influence, it's also when you travel, like you're using tourist dollars, you're booking with a tour operator, use that influence to make sure that they're not causing harm.
Amazing. Now, some of our smarty pants AJers have more complex questions. Amanda's wondering about the survival rates for animals who are born in captivity. Rob, you spoke about that, and you have some stats. Is it okay if Amanda were to reach out to you for that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so just go to the Zoocheck website, and Rob does work all the time. So and very responsive, so you can check that out there. I think Ken had a question too. So yeah, please reach out. Unfortunately, we ran out of time to cover some of that stuff. So I just want to—
Sorry, Kimberly, can I make one final point?
Absolutely, you can.
I just wanted to say that if there are any people from the zoo industry or from any of these industries that are listening, and many of them are animal people. They got into these industries because they love animals, and they are very genuine in their concern for animals, the environment, and all of that. And they should not see our side as attacking them. You know, certainly we need reform, we need change, we need a different paradigm. And part of making that happen are the people who are progressive, that think a little bit like we do, not entirely, but a little bit like we do within these industries as well. That will expedite the change that's necessary in the future. So I just wanted to say that to any of you zoo people or others out there. We're all here for the same thing, I think.
Good, good reminder, Rob. Everybody's a potential ally.
Yeah.
And it's bridge building in this world is one of the most powerful things we can be doing. So thank you so much for that reminder. Okay, so before I'm going to read you a couple of some of the promises and pledges in just a second. But first of all, I just you can take us off of gallery view, Kirsten. I just want to remind folks that this was our last Lunchtime Live of 2023. We're going to be back here on January the 10th, I think. Let me just, sorry, I should have had this ready. 11th, January the 11th, and our session is going to be about alternatives to animal testing with Charu Chandrasekhar, and Animal Justice is Caitlin Mitchell, because there is some amazing movement happening around that legislatively. So we need you to get you up to speed. So I hope you will join us for that. But Rob and Melissa, we have folks here that said, I'm going to get into Twitter and tag on Polly and Whitby, read the issue. Ken said, commenting in Whitby and Durham local social media groups to spread the word. Doug says, I'll be composing a variety of emails for various sympathetic family members to send in the next few days. So I think we've got it going. And I know myself, I have a lot of in-laws in that area, so I'm on them. we will get some action happening. Okay. All right.
Excellent.
Can
Thank
we
you.
all give a big thank you to Rob and to Melissa for all your beautiful work and for coming here today. Thank you so much. We so appreciate you. Thanks for leading the fight in this, folks. You truly are the warriors in this area of animal protection. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I look forward to seeing you in 2024, and have a great, I hope you all get a little bit of rest over the holidays. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Bye. Happy holidays.